but for the sake of keeping the schedule, we will start nevertheless. And I will chair and introduce the sessions of this afternoon. So in the first part, we will have two experts speaking on the transformation of science in the period, in the early modern period. And of course, that was an important transformation of science for several reasons. New scientific approaches emerged, new conceptualizations were made, and also a process of internationalization took place, which was driven, among others, also by the Jesuits, about whom we will learn more in the talk by Rivka Feldhay. But of course, eventually, we want to put that into the general perspective and compare it with what is also of interest now, namely the transformation of the sciences and the transformation of society that we are also currently witnessing during the period of the Anthropocene, and in particular in recent times, in current times. And we want to see which lessons we can learn from the early modern periods there, how the actors handled that, what the driving forces of the transformations were, and how the scientific content and impact and interest changed during that period. In that sense, it is my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Rivka Feldhay from Tel Aviv. In fact, during her academic career, she bridged the three important cities, three important places in Israel. She first studied history and English literature and language in Haifa. Then she went to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where in 1986, she got a degree, a PhD degree in the history of science. And then subsequently, she joined the Cohen Institute for the History of Science in Tel Aviv, where she eventually in 1997 became a professor, and she also is a director of the Minerva Institute for the Humanities. And of course, like most other speakers here, she has very strong ties to the MPI for the History of Science in Berlin, where she spent extended periods and where I think she has many ongoing, active, and very inspiring scientific collaborations. So, as I already indicated, she will speak about the Jesuits. I have to read the precise title. Theory of Science, Solving Mathematical Problems in Early Modern Jesuit Colleges. And of course, we are very much looking forward to your presentation, and we also hope that this will, of course, inspire very interesting discussion, not only about the Jesuits themselves, but also about one of the important transformative forces, and also an institution that creatively tried to link different periods of the world through science, actually. So through scientific knowledge, through spreading scientific knowledge, and of course, using scientific knowledge in the service of their religious aims, inspired by the Counter-Reformation and so on. But Rivka is the expert, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And I would like to open my words with a few words about Jürgen Renn, with whom I've had a very long period of friendship and scientific collaborations. So first of all, Jürgen and I both did our dissertation, PhD dissertation on Galileo Galilei. He did it with Galuzzi, I did it at the Hebrew University. And since then, we have maintained constant connection. We were together at the Wissenschaftskolleg for 1 year, and then Jürgen has become the chair of the board of the Minerva Center of the Humanities. And during all these years, I really realized and appreciated very much his ability to sit in sessions like that, listen very carefully to everything anybody says, and be conscious and responding and responsive to what is going on. And I'm sorry he's not here, but I feel that I had to say these words, which express my deep feeling of companionship and friendship and collaboration with him. So now I will go to my Jesuits. My lecture this afternoon will be dedicated to the Jesuits, and I'm quite sure that everyone sitting in this room has some kind of an image of Jesuits in his or her mind. Along the years, I've learned how much Jesuits have been perceived in popular imagination as hostile to modernity in general and to the newly emerging science of the 17th century in particular. Images, however, sometimes succeed in occluding very important historical features of science. By creating, and this is the main danger, I think, in this story, by creating sharp dichotomies between ancients and moderns, as well as between science and religion. And the transformation I'm referring to now in my lecture is exactly how you do science in the service of a religious order and somehow play between the ruler, the king. You will hear about what I'm going to tell you on the one hand, and the Pope on the other hand. So in these circumstances, forgotten is the fact that between the 16th and 18th century, for more than 200 years, most of the Catholic elite and Catholic scientists in particular were educated and socialized in Jesuit schools, where Torricelli, Descartes, Mersenne, Fontenelle, and many others actually studied. My aim today will be to tell you a different story about the Jesuits. I will argue that the Jesuits' religious mission was not anti-science. On the contrary, it was precisely the religious mission that pushed them to explore, teach, criticize, and argue with the ideas of the savant identified with the moderns. Thus, what we now call science, and the Jesuit named physico-mathematics, the exploration of physical phenomena with mathematical methods, had a central and very important place in Jesuit education, side by side with other innovations, such as Baroque theater, ballet, physical education, and sometimes writing. It is this aspect that I will accentuate while speaking about some strategies of doing and transforming physical mathematics into a form which I will name the theater of science. My paper will consist of two parts. First, I will present a case of solving a mathematical problem in front of large audiences, and will analyze as much as I can within the framework of the time I have, the contents and context of this problem. In the second part, I shall analyze the performance, the performative dimension of the problems and how they turned into a strategy of teaching in a peculiar cultural form. Such analysis, I hope, exposes the social function of the problem within the college and between the college and the political environment of the Jesuits. So first to the contents and the context. My example of a problem solving as a public event actually took place in the provincial congregation of the Jesuits convened in Parma on November 5th, 1614. Parma was then a flourishing university town and the capital of the rich and successful state of Ranuccio Farnese. In 1600, the Jesuits had been invited by the Farnese family to assist in building up a system of higher education in the state. Fortunately, eventually, they controlled three interrelated prestigious institutions in the city of Parma: the old university, the Jesuit college, and a Collegio dei Nobili. There, sons of noble families from all over Europe used to spend a few years in a kind of boarding school where their formation as the future serving elite of many Catholic states was meticulously taken care of. So now let me quote from a manuscript I found at Parma Archive, where a vivid description of the afternoon routine of the congregation is included. And I'm quoting from this manuscript translated from the Italian. After lunch, they took part in disputations that were 4 in theology and 1 in philosophy. Also, 2 most curious problems in mathematics, 2 problemi curiosissimi nella matematica, were demonstrated. As I don't have time to speak about both, I shall only refer to the first problem, and I'm quoting: why, when a ray of sun passes through a hole of whatever figure, it nevertheless shows the image of the sun in a circular form on the terminus ad quem, the place where it arrives. From the point of view of its contents, the problem, in contradistinction to the commentary or textbook or treatise, the problem offered an ideal space in which the old Aristotelian conceptual framework was somehow accommodated to allow for teaching and reflecting on and criticizing the results of the new science. The fact is that I don't see it here. There's not enough light. So I try to continue, but it's difficult. In this case, the problem concerned the image of the sun reflected through a hole of some finite shape and size. It was rooted in the tradition of the Aristotelian problemata and extensively discussed by all great figures of the medieval optical tradition. It was both very ancient and at the same time acquired new solutions and new meanings in the decade that preceded 1614. Thus, our problem had been discussed by Alhazen, Vitello, Bacon, Peckham, as well as by Leonardo da Vinci and the great Renaissance mathematician Francesco Maurolico. However, it was not until Kepler, the first to publish the correct geometrical solution, that the problem was given its fully fledged epistemological meaning. In his 1604 Parli Pomena ad Vitellionem, written as a commentary to Vitello, but meant to serve as an introduction to the science of astronomy, Kepler completely dismissed the whole medieval discourse on visual rays and on species emanating from the sensible object. Instead, he showed how an image of an external object is first deconstructed and then reconstructed in an inverse form on a screen, but also on the human retina, passing through the lens of the eye, And Kepler's solution implied much more than a new use of geometry, as he developed a theory of vision and an epistemology of geometrical entities that justified his solution epistemically. This kind of epistemology had implications for understanding the way images of distant objects were formed not only on a screen, but also through the telescope lenses, as is testified by Kepler's dioptrice from 1611. This problem of the image of an object on a screen or on the retina was of high importance to Jesuit mathematicians in general. Certainly, they were able to construct their own telescope a few months after the publication of the Sidereus Nuncius Galileo's on 1611, which they used for confirming most of Galileo's celestial observations. Moreover, the Jesuits soon developed an insatiable appetite for optical instruments, which they used not only for research and teaching purposes, but also for missionary propaganda outside Europe and for buttressing their status as an intellectual elite. In the fusing of practices then, the Jesuits became defenders of the telescope and other optical instruments against attacks on the epistemic credibility of these instruments. The decision to perform the problem of a sun ray passing through a pinhole could function as an emblem, smacking of traditional respectability, but also invoking all connotations that accomplished the most recent scientific and epistemological debates and controversies of the age. Is there a possibility to make more light here? Maybe. This is better. Yeah, this is really better. You hear me?
Otherwise,
Okay.
we can do like this.
No.
Can
It's
you-
fine. Yeah,
Okay.
no. Now, in spite of the fact that I have not been able to find the original text of the curious mathematical problems, I do believe that I have quite a good knowledge of the contents of these problems. In 1615, the Jesuit mathematician Josephus Blancanus published his book named Mathematical Topoi, Loci, of Aristotle, collected and explicated out of his entire effort. In that book, he collected references to mathematics from the whole Aristotelian corpus, the books of physics on the heavens and metaphysics, the biological writings, the works on ethics, politics, and up to the question on mechanics and physical problems attributed to Aristotle. Blancanus was born in Bologna and joined the society in 1592. He studied mathematics at the Collegio Umano in Rome with the mathematician Grinberger and was then sent to Parma, where he spent most of his life teaching mathematics at the Jesuit college there. Among the references he collected in his book on mathematics, on mathematical topoi, there is one taken from Aristotelian Problema Physica which Blancanus presents in the following words, and this is my translation from the Latin. Why does the light of the sun, who's centering through quadratic, why is the light of the sun, while entering through quadratic or rectangular openings, or even through small pinholes, after being received on a plane which is positioned far enough from the opening, such as a wall or a floor, is not conceived in the same shape through which it enters. In spite of the angular entrance, from the image of the light formed on the opposite place is always round, if the plane is distant enough and the ray of sun is opposite or perpendicular to the object. If it is not perpendicular, but oblique, such images will not appear entirely round, but elliptic. So this problem, Blancanus maintains, is pretty difficult, for which, as far as I know, no one of the ancients arrived at a perfect solution. In truth, neither Aristotle nor Vitello satisfied the mathematical intellect. Marwolico, in his Photismi, that appeared in 1611, and Kepler, in his Paralipomena, that appeared in 1604, offered probably arguments on this issue in the best way. It turns out from the quotation that Blancanus divided his exposition into two main parts. In the first, he unfolded two non-satisfying explanations presented as Aristotelian. Only then, in the second part, he deals with a modern and correct solution based on the work of the Moderni, Marwolico, and Kepler. And I shall briefly relate to each of these two parts. Blancanus starts the first part with a geometrical explanation taking from Aristotle's discussion of the sun projecting in a crescent shape on the earth during eclipse. Here, he invokes Aristotle's two cones joined in the apex, one between the sun and the opening, and the second between the opening and the earth. And he develops an analogy between rays of vision and sun rays in accordance with the tradition of the medieval perspectivists. To this, he adds the element of the distance of the image from the opening, which will eventually play a predominant role in his own modern solution. The second explanation he offers is more faithful to Aristotle's original problem. It invokes, again, the thesis that an angular form seen from a distance looks circular, but this is related to Aristotle's qualitative contention, according to which the angular form of the opening is not seen because sun rays falling in sharp angles are weak. My conclusion from this first part is that implicitly, though not explicitly, Blancanus actually points out to a difficulty that characterized the entire Aristotelian medieval tradition, namely the attempt to combine qualitative assumptions about the physical world of weak and strong sun rays with geometrical explanations based on the concept of visual cones. The second part of the problem opens with a chapter on the figures of light. Here, Blancanus formulates 4 principles from which he will then derive his own conclusion to the problem. Hence, the very structure of the argument is meant to emphasize its demonstrative geometrical nature. First, Blancanus restates Ibn al-Haytham principle, accepted by all medieval perspectivists, that light is emitted in straight lines to all directions from every point on the body to every point in the medium. Second, he contended that images of light sources tend to fuse in a certain distance from the screen on the basis of the theorem taken from Marolico's Foutisme. And third, he explains the principle of intersection on the basis of which both Marolico and Kepler proved that the image is projected on the screen in an inverse form. Last, Blancanus stresses that the cause of the circular image on the screen is the circular form of the sun that is transferred through each single point of the opening to the opposite screen. Blancanus then repeats Marolico's geometrical proof, which I will not recite here. However, two additional remarks in the end of the text testify to his understanding of the meaning of the solution suggested by Marolico and Kepler. The first remark concerns the inclusion of Kepler's experiment described in the second chapter to his Paralipomena that led him to wipe out Vitello's solution of the ancient problem. Kepler accompanied his description with a harsh critique of his predecessors. Blancanus chose to ignore the critique, but he quoted the experiment verbatim. I have the text here, but I don't have time to repeat it, maybe in the questions. In Kepler's experiment, the movements of light are literally described in terms of the entities, geometrical lines, having physical meaning in the world. Blancanus needed such a perception in order to substantiate his claim that the straight lines by means of which mathematicians explain the optical phenomena, such as the image of the sun on a screen, were mathematical entities that, I'm quoting from him, existed as the archetypes of all things, both in the mind of the author of nature, that is gone, as well as in the human mind. This could justify his additional claim that his explanation is universal and causal, as befitted true scientia. The Mathematical Loci, Blancanus' book from 1615, contained more than the Camera Obscura problem. In another chapter of the same book, the following title appears: On Things That Sink in Water, along with new demonstration of the problem of Archimedes, where he investigated a mixture of metals by an insoluble crown. No doubt the chapter refers to Yarrow's crown problem, mentioned in the Parma manuscript as a second curious mathematical problem recited in front of the provincial congregation. However, instead of a text, there is one line, or one single sentence printed. In this place, a commentary is required in the last chapter of the De Caelo. Meanwhile, in its place, the reader should approach Galileo's Italian discourse on bodies that move in water. End of quote. Now, Blancanus signed the dedicatory letter to his loca in Parma in 1614. The Catalogue of Jesuit teachers of mathematics in Italy shows that he held the chair of mathematics in Parma that year. It is very likely then that he wrote the two curious problems performed in front of the congregation and may have even presented them there. Be it as it may, when Blancanus finally attempted to work his problem through into a short treatise and insert it in his book, he was not allowed to do so. In my opinion, this fact indicates that the kind of Jesuit sensitivity to the problem of leaving the secure space of the college in an attempt to become just another part of society and its lay culture. So no agreement actually by the leadership of the Jesuits that they present themselves as just one part of the culture and the society of the time. Nevertheless, His book saw light in 1615 with the name of the omitted treatise on the index, while the curious reference to Galileo's discourse on things that float and move in water did remain in the body of the text. So now I would like to draw an interim conclusion from my discussion up to now concerning the dissemination and fusion of the problem. Blancano's text containing the camera obscura problem points out that under the most traditional disguise, new and modern scientific contents were discussed and delivered to students and wider audiences. The problem chosen dealt with the hottest topics like camera obscura and floating body at exactly the time when Galileo was conducting his campaign with the Aristotelians in Tuscany. So very shortly about the performative dimension of the problems. Recitations of problem in the halls of Jesuit colleges and in special public events was one activity among similar ceremonious practices that colored Jesuit educational routines with elements of drama and ritual. The problem, like the inaugural lectures at the beginning of the academic year, constituted a discursive space that mediated between the closed world of students and boarders and the wide circles of the city, its dignitaries and the rules. In the manuscript that I found, there are lots of descriptions about that. I cannot bring them here, but in the question I may be able to say something. And the next, in the text written by Christopher Clavius, written in preparation of the first Ratio Studiorum of 1586, the architect of Jesuit mathematical studies, Clavius, pointed out that the cultural thirst for teaching public lectures in mathematics in many cities exists and is very popular. By this, he meant to convince his colleagues and superiors that the society will acquire much prestige by training its scholars to develop their talent to talk about mathematics in public. And if I'm quoting from him, an effort must be made so that just like other disciplines, mathematics also may flourish in our schools, so that from this also ours will become more suited for serving the various interests of the church, especially since it is not a little unseemly that the lack of professors who are capable of presenting lectures about mathematical topics longed for it for so many years in so many cities. The recitation of problems was a regular event in Jesuit colleges. It found its pedagogical justification in the necessity to stimulate not only intellectual capacity, but also the capacity for presentation and interaction. Jesuit education put an enormous emphasis on the development of theatrical skills that accompanied many of the common activities in the college, such as repetitions, disputations, public defenses of theses, and theatrical production. The society also hoped to gain some advantage in the public sphere from such activities, no less than training students in presenting the work to their fellow students, as well as to wider circles of dignitaries and intellectuals. The recitation of problem was meant to attract visitors to the college and to contribute to the cultural life of the city. The fusion of educational purposes with more general cultural political goals found its ultimate expression in the Ratio's rule for the professor of rhetoric that captures the dramatic Baroque spirit of Jesuit education in the following word. I will not quote it here, but I can do it later on. So I suggest to see the problem as suggesting a kind of trading zone that were used in the process of mediation between the control spaces of the Jesuit enclosed behind the gates of the college and the less regulated, sometimes chaotic space of the city, bursting in so many different rhythms and plurality of cultural forms. The message for us historians is to be found in the details. I could not bring all the details here, but all the details I have really enforces, I think, this thesis. Between educators, being educators, teachers, and intellectuals did not prevent the Jesuits from playing a major social and cultural role, and even a political role, presenting themselves as mediators between the religious establishment, the Pope, for whom they performed a special vow, and the political authority of the king, the Duke of Parma, Ranuccio Farnese. They well recognized their own power in carrying and representing a scientific message. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting and inspiring contribution. I hope that we can read the details in a paper of yours and in the not too distant future, perhaps even it is available now, and I would be very interested in reading it. But now I would like to start the discussion. Are there questions?
Yeah, thank you, Rivka, for this impressive talk. Very interesting. And of course, today I hear it on the background of what we heard earlier, for instance, from Jens. And that brings me immediately to the question, you said the chaotic space of the cities. But from Jens's presentation, it was again clear there was a public culture, he called it an agonistic culture of disputes and, you know, the abacus masters. So isn't it the case that the Jesuits also, you know, appropriated this, you know, societal potential, so to say, or this existing cultural forms to bring it into their use, which changed it completely? I completely agree with there, but, you know, they kind of hooked up to a phenomenon that was already widespread in Italian cities. So that's one remark. And the second remark is, of course, it became again clear to me how well this practice prepared the Jesuits then for going to China and bringing all of these resources, the theatrical, the presentational, the pedagogical, and so on, into this. And I think without the Jesuits, this would never have happened in the same way, and perhaps not at all. So I see, in other words, a continuity between sort of an intellectual culture, not low culture, but at least not academic intellectual culture, non-academic intellectual culture in Italian cities, and the role that the Jesuits then played in imperial and colonial enterprises, so to say.
Thank you. So no doubt that the Jesuits in one aspect of their activities were part of what was going on in the Italian cities. Later on, I'm now working on Louis XIV, and there it is even more striking what they were doing. On the other hand, the leaders of the Jesuits were really careful and even afraid of being, you know, just becoming one of the other different groups. especially educators and cultural actors and so forth. So what I didn't speak about, but I speak about that in another place, is the tension that this creates between the king or the ruler, less in Italy, more in France on the one hand, and the Pope, who wants to intervene via the Jesuits in the politics of the place. So the Jesuits are always torn out between these two roles that they are playing. And therefore, I was stressing in this lecture, the caution of the leaders that will be able to keep the Jesuits as a separate group. This doesn't happen. And in fact, in France of Louis XIV, we see it in a much more prominent form. And I want to say, here I stressed their role as educators, spreaders of the mission and so forth. But in another place, I have to stress the tension within the Jesuits that are always split, either between the Pope and the King, or between the city and the college and so forth. It brings about many conflicts, but conflict means dynamics. And that is my main point, that, it's not just an old-fashioned mission that they are playing. They are really actors in this field.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, very illuminating.
Yeah, there's another short question by Manfred over there. So we will get a little behind schedule. I hope this is okay, because I think there should be some interesting discussion.
Rivka, I was very intrigued by all those conflicts that you listed. And would you say that a lesson that can be drawn from your study of the Jesuits is sort of the role of scientists in today's society?
In a way, yes. I want to just stress that all this is being done in a very traditional environment, that on the other hand is eager to adopt, as Johan said, from the larger society innovations. And this is very problematic for us moderns to see that it's not simply a dichotomy. It's, it's much more complex than that. And the use of the dichotomies to describe and explain this situation brings about the kind of, idea that Jesuits were simply a part of the Ancien Régime, the old world. And in this period, this is really not true. And therefore, I have to say both that they are trying to remain attached to their original purpose, and on the other hand, they are torn out by all these conflicts. Yes, it is a kind of pre-modern, form of the conflicts that science in the modern world experience. I agree.
There was another question by Gerd here.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I always wondered what do you think about the role of the Jesuits in the 17th century? You talked about Kepler and this time 1615. That was the period of great reform. Rudolf II was substituted by Matthias. The Emperor Matthias was originally Protestant, converted to become Jesuits. Then the 30 Years' War practically destroyed German university life. So when you mentioned all these famous names of Jesuit scientists, surprisingly few are from the Roman German Empire. And the same destructive role the Jesuits played in Poland, where there was originally at that period a very strong Protestant community and population, and the Jesuits managed to totally expel Protestantism in Poland, which is valid until today. So one seems to have a split picture over the world of the constructive and scientifically supportive role of the Jesuits. When you look at France, Italy, and the more Western winners of the 30 Years World War in Europe, and when you compare it to Middle Europe, where it was, in my understanding, ended as a complete disaster. Would you agree with that rough picture?
You know, from my general knowledge, yes, but I must emphasize here, I'm really no expert on the Roman Empire and on the Polish background and so forth. So, as I said, I think that we have to go deeply into the details. And if I brought to you here all the details of what Ranuccio did for the Jesuits, how he accepted them, how he sent his carriages to take them from one place to another, you see that this type of relationship is really close, but it has a price, as you say, and the price is much more prominent when you look at the German areas and the Polish areas and so forth than in Italy and France, where it is much more ambiguous, or in China. Eventually, though, we have to remember the Jesuits were expelled from France. They had very many problems in China and in the East and so forth. It's not a simple picture. What I try to emphasize just for this talk is, this other side that is not known. But you're right. In a book that I'm writing, there are these not the case studies of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, but even in the countries that I'm looking at, mainly France and Italy, it's much more complicated even than that. I just picked up one aspect because it's deeply in the mind and the images of us, modernity, but it's not the whole story.
At the end of this afternoon, we will have a concluding discussion, and I think these are important issues for that discussion. And also, since we are much behind the schedule now, I would like to go on to the next speaker for the moment, but keep your questions in mind and we can discuss the role of science between conflicting goals and also using science for particular other goals later on in our discussion further. So with that,
thanks a lot for your attention.
Let's thank Rivka for the beautiful and very inspiring talk. And as I said, I'm looking forward to seeing the material in print. Now, the next speaker is Pietro Mordeo, and I've been instructed to keep the presentations of those speakers that are particularly known to the audience short. And with that, I will only mention that Pietro is a professor for the philosophy of science at University Ca' Foscari in Venice. And in fact, yesterday I had a very pleasant and constructive day with your colleague Massimo Vaclien, who said some very nice words about you. But Pietro is on one hand also an expert on the science in the early modern period, but on the other hand also is working on political and historical epistemology. And as I understand, in his talk, he will combine these two aspects. It will be about, the topic is geopraxis. I guess you can understand or imagine what this is about, and it will be about the role of science and scientific epistemology in the current age, of course, inspired by his deep historical knowledge. So please, Pietro.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to this meeting. I've been thinking a lot, Jürgen, about the topic to bring to this audience. Since we have been working together for years, there are so many intersections, so many topics. So in the end, as a birthday present, I bring you some thoughts on geoanthropology, and I do that by bringing you an idea. So the geopraxis idea as a starting point to continue, actually, thinking about geoanthropology in a praxeological direction. So my standpoint has been already introduced. It's the material history of science imbued of theoretical concerns. I'll explore the concept today and bring you a series of images, views, elements about the environment I became most familiar with in recent years, which is Venice and its lagoon. So it's a geomorphological, historical context that is particularly apt to present a geopraxeological perspective. So I started by exploring what is available in the field of expressions of ideas, and I came across this idea of cosmopoiesis, which I'd like to bring to you first. I found it in an early modern publication by Philoponus, very well known to historians of early modern science, Galilean studies. Philoponus is the 6th century commentator of Aristotle, who developed ideas that were important for further developments. Being, for instance, the idea of impetus has been often ascribed to him. This is a book on pericosmopoias. It's actually a lesser known work by him. It's about the creation. It's a commentary on the Genesis. So I thought, okay, here we have a geoanthropological image, very clearly so, but it's in a mystified form, if you like to call it like that. It's a projection of human action of creating our own world. So we can use the tools of Religionskritik, if you like, to appropriate and follow on the usage of certain concepts. Feuerbach is a useful tool. Marx used to say that all critique begins with the critique of religion. So here we are. I start from the Hexameron. And then we have another concept in the field that is floating around, often quoted, techniques. It has also been used in relation to the Anthropocene debate. It stems from Yu Kuei work on the question concerning technology in China. It looks very much at the mythological formulations of ideas about technology, looking at mythology as a source as a working tool to think of the settings within which, cultural settings within which technology is developed. So we have, of course, our familiar myths, the Promethean moment, which has been often mentioned in relation to the Anthropocene, the burning humans, making use of tools, fire being the symbol of it. You know the story of the stealing of the fire and the punishment, which is a myth that points to the ambivalences of scientific culture. In your book, in your recent book, Jürgen, you mentioned the golem history as a narrative element to think of cultural ambivalences in the scientific culture. But what are we doing with these mythologies? Huey proposes to differentiate, to look at various narratives. We don't have to stick and to universalize any account. And what we need to do is to look beyond the mythology and historicize and understand the historical developments of technology. So it's not just the embedment in cultural settings and mythologies, but it's about material history. So we have to look, as we are used to look at structures, to look at contexts of globalization, of globalism, and exchanges and transmission of knowledge. So I skip other concepts that are in the field, like cosmopolitics by Stenger, with all these echoes or new mythologies about Gaia. Let me go to the geopraxis. I think we have a task ahead. This task is to, first of all, to bring together epistemic history and human history. This is a claim that we got used to. It's first of all a methodological question, or if you like, an epistemological one. We have to keep together the history of science. Let me point to a formative work, Copernicus Revolutions. We need to have a historical approach to the sciences together with a good understanding of social, political, and historical dynamics. Since it's the 14th of July, I bring to you the image of it's probably not the 14th of July, 1789, this picture, but okay, the idea of looking at history, at the structures, at the developments, as well as the ruptures, at the revolutions in the history of ideas, as well as in human history. So the challenge here is not just to bring these two perspectives together, but it's to think of them in material terms, as a material history that is connected to environmental transformations. Here you are a productive tool, I think, to think of the transformation of the world by humans. It's the praxeological perspective per se. It's Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, which was translated and retranslated by many, among which Antonio Gramsci, in his prison notebooks, he tried to translate from German, making some productive mistakes. One is, and I read it first from Italian, sorry for that, but I think it's interesting. He writes about La dottrina materialistica. This is the third thesis on Feuerbach, che gli uomini sono il prodotto dell'ambiente e dell'educazione. So humans are the product of the environment, look at this, l'ambiente, and of education, e che pertanto i cambiamenti degli uomini sono il prodotto di altro ambiente e di una mutata educazione. So education, Rivka. So humans are forged by their environment, which is a cultural one, not only a material one. Education is crucial. Dimentica che appunto l'ambiente è modificato dagli uomini. So not only humans are the product of their environment, but they change and transform their environment. German word for this is very different. It's die Veränderung der Umstände, so it's the circumstances, I would say. But I think it's a productive misunderstanding that we have here, because that allows us to appropriate a praxeological perspective and to think in terms of education, of culture, of various layers of environment, including the material one. Gramsci wrote about the rovesciamento della praxis, which is the Umwälzen der Praxis of Engels, first edition of the Feuerbach thesis, which is more explicitly the revolutionary one in the original text. So far so good on these floating ideas. I think they might be of inspiration to talk about praxeology of the Anthropocene. Here you are, the recent edition of your book, Jürgen, which I was very glad to receive. It looks impressive. I know that already from earlier discussions and from the English edition, which I also discussed with students, very interesting. From that book, I will take two ideas that are key for me and allow me to illustrate historical cases later on. So the first idea is the ergosphere. You know how much I like this idea, Jürgen, because it points to the relevance of labor, working, transformative processes of humankind to make sense of the transformations of the Earth system. So the specific attention to the ergon, to the work, is something I think is very important, especially coming from a material history of science. And second, the idea of an epistemic history of world transformation. So I see in this book a challenge to historians of science to think beyond the history of ideas or the history of science's theories, but looking at the history of ideas as a history of the world. So we move from an epistemic history to an ontological history or a material history of the world that is transformed, has been constantly transformed by techno-scientific activity. So that said, I come to my my context. So let's come down. So let's land in a concrete setting. That's Venice, Venezia, in this painting from 1547 by Benedetto Bordone. This is a prototype of a natural artificial setting. Venice has been recently called the cyborg city. It's human and it's artificial, it's natural. It's, we can say with Massimo Varglin, a living artifact in which we can see the geological inscription of human history, human activities, human agency. So Venice and its natural artificial lagoon, I point to the 16th century because this was a very important moment in deciding to keep the lagoon as it is today. There were engineering, scientific, and political decisions that were taken and led to the maintenance of today's Venice. Venice is an island. I could say a lot about the image of Venice as a lagoon and the image of Venice as an island, which has a lot of important echoes in political thinking of the autonomy of the island, the republic that is self-sustained. And this is very much also in the iconography of islands. Here we have Porcacchi, l'isole più famose del mondo, the most famous islands in the world, in which Venice is compared to other islands, other water cities. For instance, the great city of Temistan, Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City today. Look at the representation in the 16th century. These are twin water cities. There are two artificial natural settings, urban settings, and lake-like lagoon settings. Comparison also occur with islands in the sense we are more ready to accept today. For instance, this is an image of England. Here it is, a bit difficult to see at first glance. And other islands look real and imaginary. This is Thomas More's Utopia in the 1516 edition. So we have a geomorphology of a place that is a place in which human history is deeply inscribed. We can point to the archaeosphere, the archaeological layers that are part of the geomorphological map of this place, the lagoon of Venice and its surroundings. Marco Cornaro, who is considered to be the initiator of Venetian hydrology, explored not only the lagoon, but the whole river connections, the whole territory, and came to, ended up writing a very important text about the history of the Lagoon of Venice, its natural artificial conditions and the way to preserve it, pointing to the necessity to look both at scriptures, that is written sources stemming from history, and experiencia. Experiencia is the observation of what is still visible, and what is visible is the natural, the artificial channels, and archaeological elements too. So this is a Roman pavement in the Lagoon of Venice. We have many archaeological remainings. This is a lesser known small mosaic of Roman times in Treviso, not far from Venice. And here you see two important elements of the economy of the place in antiquity, and I would say till today: fishing and agriculture. So two very important activities connected to the territory, lesser known than famous mosaics like the Aquileia ones, which are very interesting because they don't only point to fish, this is close to here, but also to human activities of interaction with the living fauna of the watery settings that had certain continuity in history. So from Grado to Venice and Ravenna, Venice not yet existing, there was a long connection of similar environments and similar ways of living that we in part can reconstruct through historical sources. So this led me to work more closely on ways of living with the environment and interacting, especially the fisherman community. The fisherman community that is here represented had a very prominent and visible role in early modern Venice. This is a traditional clash taking place on the Ponte dei Pugni, on this bridge in Venice. Once a year, it was a popular habit. the fishermen from Castello, from this part of the city, from Dorso Duro, and the Nicolotti came together. So a very visible community, very important for the life and economy and the culture of the city, including for science. I'll come that in a moment. It was a community that was strictly regulated in its way to deal with their activities. For instance, the selling of the fish. We have sources that tell us much about regulations about fish, way of dealing and selling fish, that are also to be found in printed books as well as in material forms. This is in the fish market of Rialto. You have the measures of the fish that can be sold and cannot be sold. And in these documents, you have information about fishing, fish reproduction, and the way the fishing should be regulated in order to permit the preservation of living species. So we have an inscribed knowledge that is inscribed, codified, including in legislation. Documents are preserved in the archives. So speaking about the interaction between the anthroposphere and the biosphere, between humans and living species, there are regulations as old as from the 14th century prescribing in what times of the year to fish certain species. I'm not reading these documents, but there is a rich documentation, and especially in the State Archive of Venice, not only there, but especially there, for instance, prescribing historically not to do what in the 20th century has been done, to fish the juvenile. So there has been changes also in their habits, and that led also to big problems about fishing and the reproduction of specific species. These are images from the 20th century, in a time in which basically the fishing of certain of small fish was liberalized, and so you could even document it in printed. So let me come to a specific fish. That's the gobius, the go. It's the most regulated fish in Venice. It's a small fish that lives in the lagoon and reproduces beneath the soil of the lagoon. So in certain times of the year, still today, people go and fish it per hand. So if you know where the whole of this fish is, you can capture that per hand. Regulations from the Middle Ages up to the 18th century, 19th century are very strict about regulating this practice, because that hinders this fish from regulation. The constancy of laws about this and regulations shows that there has been a persistent or continuous practice of fishing this fish in this manner, in spite of continuous attempts to regulate. These are images taken from Venice, probably from some local person. It's clear from the writing. These are Konrad Gessner's manuscript images of fish that he collected as a Swisser, as a Swiss person in the Alps, who went only twice to the sea. That's what he writes. Gessner, one of the most famous naturalists from the 16th century, called himself a Homo Mediterraneus, a man who lives between the lands, because he was to the sea only twice, and published a huge work on ichthyology, collecting this sort of images. These are, for instance, sent from Venice. And here you are the final result of this collection of knowledge codified in this form. This is the most regulated fish, as I told you, and it's still part of the local culture. I don't know if those of you who know Venice, if you ever tried the risotto al go. I'm not here to show you myself eating in a restaurant, but to point to the persistency, so the long history of certain practices, including eating. Here I'm talking with a cook, and I made interesting discoveries by talking with him about the name of the species, on how to look further in historical sources. Food is very revealing of the way people live in their environment. The go is a fish that is not really high esteemed these days, because it's too thin, it has no flesh, it is full of spines. So it is even now hard to find a restaurant that still cooks it. Whereas from my sources, it appears that has been the basis of the alimentation of the vanity, and the vanity should be understood in a very large, the Venetians in a very large sense. The Venetia in Roman times was a larger region than just Venice. So for instance, Martial, the poet, in the 1st century of the current age wrote that although in the region of Venetia, this large region that included also today's Venice, people have lavish banquets, usually Gobius is eaten at the beginning of the dinner. Juvenal tells us that it's not so good as a fish. Do not desire a goat fish, which I think it's a trilla in the Latin, if you only have a Gobius. So in the Renaissance, they started asking, what are the properties, what are the qualities of this fish? Ulisse Aldrovandi, the famous naturalist, this is a picture from one of his books, asks the question on nutrient, is it nutritive, is it nutrient, is it good for health? And he writes, just quote, as Athenaeus reports on the basis of Ignatius, the Gobius has a lot of juice. That's true. That's why we make risotto with Gobius, which can easily be extracted. They do not nourish much and produce no good juice. When it turns golden, its meat has little substance to it. It is less fat, the juice. If it is less fat, the juice lighter and less abundant. But owing to its bigger size, it is more nourishing. It was basically the food of the poor people. So for centuries, even millennia, this was the basis of the alimentation in the territory of those fishermen that I pointed to at the beginning. We have tariffs. So the fish market was strictly regulated. The price of fish was given. And there we can discover the price of Gobius. It's very cheap. Actually, it's one of the cheapest fish. Small one, it costs the same as a frog. So you can buy either a frog or a Gobius. It's the same price. You can see the economic value also of this basic alimentation good. The fishermen, in spite of being poor, had a fundamental function in society. They collaborated with political authorities, they collaborated with scientific authorities, among which the magistrate for waters, and this triangulation between the magistrate for waters, the Senate, and the people of San Nicolò, which are the fishermen, is documented even in, is well documented in historical materials. For instance, this request to map the territory to distinguish private and public waters in order to preserve public waters for fishing. So you see, it is a sort of anti-enclosures activity of protecting the territory that involved the fisherman community, and concrete historical projects of, or concrete scientific projects of mapping the territory to distinguish private, fenced and closed areas in the fishing valley. This is the way they look today, no time to discuss. And also, we can appreciate the interaction between technical officers, those of the water magistrate who were taking care of the territory, the water, the channels, the coastal lines, with fishermen who were interviewed, and they were asked their opinion about what interventions to do, what the consequences of interventions were, etc. So given the late time, instead of going on, I have many more images for you, Jürgen, but I think we can go through them in the discussion time later, or in another moment. Just go through, you can register nice images on which we will later speak. This is historical cartography from the magistrate of the waters, tidal, wind, assessments of the organic nature of the lagoon of Venice. You see, it's almost like a plant in this representation from the 16th century. Engineering projects from the 18th century concerning the Brenta River, a way of communication, a very important source of drinkable water. It is all interventions that had to do with the Brenta River connecting Padua to Venice had to take into account all these dimensions. Transportation, drinkable water, agriculture. This is still present in the image of the villa, which are not just the Palladian beautiful legacy, but they were centers of agricultural and land power. Water mills, so uses of water also for windmills, as a source of energy, and tensions between various possible uses of water still today, industrial uses, fishing uses, and so on. Very rapidly, let me point to the Anthropocene problem. Today we face, so we should activate all this knowledge to face the impending climate crisis, which is iconic in Venice. I'm not discussing this image and the nuances, technological solutions, but it's not only about extreme cases and dramas, it's very much about everyday life. Look at this image that they took. Waters are higher. No, we cannot transport anymore very well in the city of Venice. So it's not only the macro problem, it's everyday life that gets transformed. So in conclusion, I propose to look at Venice as a paradigm or a case of geopraxis, as I called it. It is about the inscription of agency in the territory, in the land and waterscapes. And by agency, I mean both politics and labor. So it's the ergosphere, and it is also the collective decisions, government, management, interest, power relations, all these elements that need to be taken into account as well. I leave the geopraxis concept for further discussion later. I propose, or I try to propose, this mixture. I leave to the floor the productive connection of these two elements, and I hope I gave some elements of inspiration for the geoanthropological research that is ahead of you, Jürgen. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much for this inspiring lecture full of detailed historical material. We are a little behind time, so the coffee break should end soon. And so perhaps we just may have, if Jürgen, of course, wants to ask a short question, he should go ahead. If this is not the case, if you want to leave it for further discussion, I stop the session now. We have a coffee break, maybe a little shorter, about 15 minutes. Then we'll have the talk by David Walpot, and afterwards we have a discussion involving Pietro, myself, and perhaps some participants that I shall recruit during the coffee break.
Very good. Thank you. Nana,
Thank you. Please. Yeah, so the door is being closed. If you want to come in, I'm closing the door now. Okay, David, if you're ready, then we should slowly get started. So this is the last talk of today, which will be given by David Wolpert. Let me first introduce him briefly. He is a native of South Africa, but he got his undergraduate education in physics at Princeton University, and then he went on to the University of Santa Barbara, where he got a PhD in 1989. And from 1989 to 1997, he worked at the Los Alamos National Laboratory and also at the Santa Fe Institute. In 1997, he joined the NASA Ames Laboratory in California, where he worked on what might be described as in the early period of machine learning and statistical analysis and the coordination of different agents. And then in 2011, he became a professor at the Santa Fe Institute, where he has been ever since. He was also a distinguished visiting scholar at my own institute, the Max Planck Institute for Mathematics and the Sciences in Leipzig, first in 2011, and then frequently returning for many exciting collaboration projects. And he has a manifold expertise and scientific experience in statistical learning and inference, for instance. So he is known for the no free lunch theorem. Of course, it was a little contradicted today because we did have a free lunch, but never mind. And he made important contributions to machine learning, to theoretical neuroscience, to game theory, to social evolution, as we will learn about today, and of course, and currently in particular to non-equilibrium statistical mechanics and thermodynamics. Now today he will speak about scale and information processing thresholds in social Holocene evolution, and we are much looking forward to your presentation, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Jürgen. My loss is that I cannot point to a long string of collaborations with Jürgen Renn in the future, but exactly so. But this might be the start of a happy future relationship. So thinking about what to talk about today, evolution of knowledge is obviously something that's done at the level of an entire society. And broadly speaking, I'm always much more comfortable moving around. Knowledge evolves in human societies through a process in which essentially society as a whole can be viewed as a computer. Oh, what do you know? Ask and you shall receive. Okay, so does that work? Okay, cool. All right, so knowledge evolves in human societies in a process by which the society as a whole can be viewed, loosely speaking, as a computer. It is creating new information. It is taking in what we as a human species learn from our environment, from our attempts to build cities, to go to war, to do all the kinds of fun things that we do. And that knowledge is then processed to create new programs and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to be presenting today is some results with a whole bunch. Do it here. There we go. A whole bunch of collaborators. Technical difficulties. Don't have the knowledge of how to deal with this quite yet. And two of them in particular, Jaewon Shin, he was an undergraduate working with me. Hajime was a postdoc. Brendan was another postdoc who's now at DeepMind. Tim Kohler is a archaeologist at University of Washington, does a lot of great work on the Pueblo Southwest, and Michael Price is another archaeologist. And what we were doing in this project was using a data set that Peter Turchin, who's now joined to the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna and the University of Connecticut, a data set that he put together concerning societies on all 6 inhabited continents over many, many thousands of years to just basically do, in essence, a kind of a time series analysis, and finds that there's striking regularities in how all of human societies have developed. These apply to the new world, to the old world. It's kind of flabbergasting because we all know that this can't be correct, except that the data is pretty much inarguable. What we then did in this project, so I'll first review some of that pioneering work, which is now about actually 5 years old, I guess. And what we did was we took a much more careful statistical analysis than Peter was able to in his original paper. And we found that, among other things, there seems to be a striking regularity across all societies, all continents, where first a society, these are ancient societies now, this is archaeological data. First, a society will grow in scale, grow in size, without much development of its information processing capabilities. Then, ka-chung, it hits a hinge point at a very clear point in the overall progress in which it stops growing in size, but develops greater computational capabilities until it reaches a next threshold in which it says, okay, we don't need to increase our ability to actually generate new knowledge anymore. We can go back to growing in size. I don't know, maybe from a certain perspective, we all like living in a Malthusian trap. But anyway, it's kind of flabbergasted. So this is the paper that kickstarted it, PNAS, Peter Turchin, and as you can see, many, many others. These are all, he chose these group, maybe not so much him, but these are people who are archaeologists with expertise all over the world. So very, very different domains. Every one of these are different architects, these different archaeologists, they actually curated the data that concerned their part of the world. And this paper is analyzing all that data together. So what they did is the following. They divided the world into 10 regions, and in each region they selected 3 locations, natural geographic areas, NGAs they call them, and here are the 30. The polities in each region, the society, so to speak, they were chosen. This is already, they're playing games with the statistics that's a little bit dubious, but they chose polities from each region to represent early, intermediate, and late appearances of politically centralized states. So they were trying to de-bias the data by going in and manipulating it a little bit. And so here's what they did. For all of these identifiable polities, they came up with 400 or so in each of the 30 NGAs at 100-year time slices. This is longitudinal data, which is absolutely crucial to be able to do these kinds of analyses, going from as far back as 9600 BCE up to close to being the modern era. For each polity, they agreed on how to quantify 51 different variables. So all these experts in these different areas of the planet, different civilizations, they assessed what the values were for each of the polities in their natural geographic area for all these 51 variables according to agreed on criteria among all the participants, all the co-authors, at these 100-year intervals. Then, and here's some more somewhat dubious statistical legerdemain, which is fine for a first pass, which is all this paper did, was that they aggregated these into 9 complexity characteristics, CCs, and they called this the Seshat data set. But there's lots of statistical issues that went on with this data. I should say there's a whole nother follow-on project, which I'm not going to be talking about today, in which rather than what is done in this paper and what I will be presenting, instead, we're actually using some very powerful tools in machine learning that allow us to fit what are called Fokker-Planck dynamics to the data sets, which allow us to avoid all these statistical issues. But in any case, enough talking about the data here, or enough talking about, or whatever, generalities. Here's actually the different fields. So these are the 51 different variables. And here were the 9 complexity characteristics that they use to characterize them. So government, there were things like how many bureaucrats you have, do you have a court system, which includes judges, is there an explicit legal code, and so on. Here are some of the ones that are going to be important for me later on in this presentation. What kind of information systems do you have for actually storing it? What are the texts? And so on and so forth. Okay, so they made this data across essentially all time and space. And then they did the dumbest possible thing you can imagine, which makes sense for a first pass, but it should have been a failure. But it actually succeeded. They ran a simple principal components analysis fit to that data, just aggregating it across all time and space. And they actually got something that's amazing. They found that the principal component analysis, to people who don't know, that's basically you just fit all of your data with a single Gaussian. So this data lives in a 9-dimensional space. Every single polity is evolving in time somewhere in this 9-dimensional space of 9 complexity characteristics. And then you just assume, oh, there's a Gaussian distribution somewhere that generated. What do I think the characteristics of that Gaussian distribution are? That's principal components analysis, PCA, absolutely drop dead dumb. And they did that, and what they found was that the first principal component, that means that when you fit the Gaussian, you're going to have a first major, most important axis of variation. That one explained almost 80% of all the variation. And moreover, there was no single one of those 9 complexity characteristics that dominated. All of them came into play. So what that means, essentially, is that if you just find out where your society is on this particular first principal component, you have located yourself. People have seen that joke t-shirt that astronomers like to use, where there's a picture of the Milky Way galaxy and there's an arrow saying you are here. There's a similar thing that we can do for a human civilization. This should not be possible, but the data does confirm it. The single PC, the first principal component, is almost all the data variance. They actually did all kinds of cross-validation tests to make sure that this was all statistically significant across the different complexity characteristics. They also, to make sure that what they were seeing was not simply due to migrations, that sort of a development in one part of the, say, Mideast would then quickly disseminate into Europe and so on. They considered the difference between the old world and the new world. So you've got this really big lake in between the two, which presumably impeded the migrations. And they found that the same model held in both, which implies that this actually is a human universal. Here are for, by the way, for any, in this room, I assume we're all history junkies. So it's absolutely fascinating to look back at these plots of different societies across time. So here, for example, is Upper Egypt is in red, the Middle Yellow River Valley. These are two of the NGAs, there's a blue, and this is in time, PC1. As I say, PC1, the first principal component, that vector in the space of 9 complexity characteristics, that explains 78% of how advanced you are as a civilization. Here are some other ones. As you can see, there are some collapses. So for example, Latium is right there, the Latium plain, and basically the collapse of the Roman Empire. You can see it right there. Blue, I forget what's going on in the Kachi plain. There was some catastrophe that happened to blue, the Kachi plain, negative 1500 BCE. It's really just fascinating stuff. You could sit there and start to think about what's going on. Okay, so that was the major results of their paper. Needless to say, it made a big splash. What we then did in our paper follow-up was to do basically the second step. They did the correct first step, and we followed up by saying, okay, let's go through the data a little bit more carefully and see what we can see. So, principal component analysis. Let's say, I'm going to give an example now of some of the strange, why PCA is such a dumb thing to do in general. Here, I'm just looking at a 2-dimensional plot. I've made up some data points. They happen to be lying on a sine curve. I can run a principal component analysis on this data. You will find the first principal component is this red arrow there. The green is the second principal component. You only have 2 principal components because you're in a 2-dimensional space in this case. And you're going to say almost all of the data is explained, all the variation of the data is explained by where you are on the first principal component. Well, some of it's explained, I guess, sure, but the variation from side to side is clearly very important. So we want to be able to dive into the data a little bit more carefully. So in light of this effect, well, guess what? We just did the dumbass thing ourselves. We just said, okay, well, let's look at the PC1 versus PC2 for the Seshat data set. Lo and behold, it actually looks a lot like a sine wave. So what we're seeing here, this is, we call them, cropped off here, hinge points. This is what I was saying at the beginning about how there's a threshold in which you are first growing in size without developing much in the way of information processing. Then you develop your information processing and then in size again. And that's basically this pattern that you'll be seeing that I'll show you in a little bit. So just as a way of calibrating yourself, something like, well, the Roman Empire is anomalous, but let's say the transition, the late Roman Republic or something like that, it would be somewhere around the middle of this curve. So what's going on that curve? Here, okay, so here are the 9 complexity characteristics. Here are the components of the first, the principal component vector in that 9-dimensional space. So it's a vector, and here are its entries. And as I've now mentioned a couple of times, it actually explains 78% of the variation. Principal component 2, by definition, has to be orthogonal. Principal component 1, since principal component 1, the units were chosen so that all these loadings of the vector components are all positive. That means principal component 2 must have some negative values. Notice it has negative values on things that have to do with the size of the polity. What is its population? How much territory does it have? What is the population of the capital? What are the number of levels in the government? And over here are what we can loosely view as attributes of a polity that allow it to evolve and create new knowledge. How sophisticated is its writing system? There are different gradations for the writing system. How prevalent are texts? Monetary system. Is it barter? Is it fiat? If it's fiat money, then, or is it independent? Is it like coin-based money? How sophisticated is the money system? Monetary system. And so, let me spend a little bit of time on this slide. This is an explanation of why we get that sawtooth sine wave. So this is that sawtooth sine wave again. So this is PC2 is up that way, PC1 is this way. What's going on, if you look at just recall that I drew attention to, distinguished these complexity characteristics for which PC2 is negative from those for which PC2 is positive. That's very important because what you'll see is here to the left of the first hinge point, since they're negative components, the sizes of the PC2 that have to do with size of your polity, the scalar ones that have to do with like population and so on, those ones are actually growing in magnitude very fast because they're negative values. That means that them growing very fast so that this curve is dropping very fast compared to these are the ones that have to do with information processing. Then when we get into this middle region, suddenly these scalar ones, the population size ones, they are not changing that much, whereas these ones are now changing much faster, and then they flip the roles. So this is what's going on. So this is the basis of saying essentially that you grow in size, then you grow in your ability to generate new knowledge, and then you grow in size again. And as I keep on emphasizing, this is 30 civilizations across thousands and thousands of years in all 6 continents. This is how evolution evolves. This is actually the time series. That's PC1, that's PC2. An amazing looking curve. This is all the different colors are the 30 different natural geographic areas, the 30 different NGAs. You look at this and does questions fall from the sky? For example, most obviously, why is there no civilization society that ever was in these particular parts of the grid? What's causing that? That's one question you can ask. Another one is that we just look at this broadly speaking, then at first what seems to happen is societies spread apart from one another at a certain stage of development. And then, to use biological language, they canalize. They all then seem to get sucked into the exact same trajectory where they're now going in the same direction and all aiming at the same spot. And moreover, if you'll notice the transitions, so here is where they start spreading apart very much, and then here is where they're canalizing. These are actually those 2 hinge points. Well, so something that wasn't obvious, remember I said before that the same pattern all across the world, even if you compare the New World to the Old World, almost, but not quite. These patterns hold for all Old World societies, those are the ones in blue. And we don't have enough data to be sure of this, it looks like they do not hold for New World societies. New World societies did not seem to be going through the spreading process. We're not sure because these parts of the space are not represented in our data sets for New World societies. That, by the way, I should point out that in the Seshat data, there was no Inca civilization, there were no Aztecs, only some pre-classical Mayan civilizations. So that, if we were to put those other civilizations in here, then there would have been more data points over there, but Peter and his collaborators chose not to do that. And then, let's see, how much time do I have here again? 10 minutes. Okay, so I'll go through 2 more points. Peter and his collaborators then realized that they can actually use this kind of analysis to address some really profound, deep questions that have been extremely controversial in the literature for a long time. One of them has to do with the onset of what's sometimes now called moralizing high gods. Here is a cartoon that some people, Joe Heinrich is a particular promoter of this view, and there are many others that they promote it. The idea is the following, that for societies to get past a certain level of complexity, I must be willing to collaborate, to trust somebody that I've never ever met. So in game theoretic terms, there's not going to be any, and I will never be interacting with them directly. So in game theoretic terms, there's no reason for reciprocal altruism. There's no reason for us to engage in cooperate in the prisoner's dilemma rather than defect. That is an attribute of all large societies where they are actually coordinated. The entire society is acting together as one. The hypothesis is, this is tied up with stuff like the axial age, which, as an aside, Peter has another paper pointing out that the whole notion of the axial age is really pretty much junk. It's not supported. Yeah, I mean, this is a very good paper by Peter. And he just goes through the data carefully and he says, no. It's people seeing patterns in Rorschach tests. But in any case, so the notion is that behind this moralizing high gods, this hypothesis of Joe Heinrich and others, is that in order for society to get far beyond essentially the scale in which there's a possibility that I might meet somebody I'm cooperating with face to face, for them to get very big, we need to actually change our religion. It won't do anymore for us to have Greek gods who are just very much like human beings, who just say, so long as you give me enough sacrificial goats, I'm happy and your life will be good. That's the only thing that determines you. That the crucial thing, and again, this is tied up with the notion of the axial age, is that you have moralizing high gods who say that what's important is that you be good, that you cooperate, that you turn the other cheek, that you don't go around and shoot and kill everybody in your own society. Once you have that notion in your culture, according to this hypothesis, that would then allow people to cooperate with complete strangers. Once you are fearful of going to a hell, not depending on whether you sacrifice enough goats, but depending on whether or not you are a good person, that supposedly will induce much more in the way of playing prisoner's dilemma, where it's cooperate, rather than a bunch of defects. So that was a hypothesis. And then there's a bunch of other people who say, no, we don't believe that at all. We do not believe that moralizing high gods are a precondition for such a jump in social complexity. So this paper, which is actually now, it's no longer recent, it's 3 or 4 years out of date, by Peter and others, they actually had to rescind this paper. But here I want to work through how you could have done what they tried to do in a better way. What they tried to do is use Seshat to address this question. Do you need moralizing high gods for a jump in complexity or not? So their idea was that you look for each of the polities in Seshat, you do a time series analysis of PC1 values. Remember, that's the one they are viewing as basically what's called statistics and instruments, a measure of complexity. That's the one that explains everything about your development as a society. And they look for PC1 values that do large jumps. They interpret that as a jump in complexity. They then simply ask, well, did those jumps precede the onset in that society of moralizing high gods or not? So that's how they're going to be trying to use their Seshat data set to address this very long, controversial, important issue. Their conclusion was that the moralizing gods always happened, in fact, after the jump in complexity. So it's certainly not a precondition. And in fact, they concluded that the causal arrow is the other way, that once you jump in complexity, then you can start going around and worshiping Jesus and or the Buddha or whomever. Okay, but they had if you go into their statistics, there was a subtlety that they introduced that caused an artifact because of a problem. Notice this general idea. In order to be able to determine has the PC1 data gone through a jump before or after moralizing God onset, you need to exclude from your data, set, all societies in which your time series does not go to before the onset of the moralizing gods. If the moralizing gods came into your society 3,000 years ago, but we've only got PC1 values that start from 2,000 years ago, you're not going to be able to see, did the moralizing gods arise before your society made this jump or not? So we throw that out of the data set. Not a good idea, folks, to throw anything out of your data set ever. But that's what they tried to do. This introduces actually huge statistical biases. You can show this, and they kind of missed that point. What we decided to do instead was use these hinge points to assess the social complexity. And what you get, kind of no surprise, that there's not much relationship at all between moralizing high gods and jumps in complexity. They're, somewhere down, there might be some relationship, presumably everything is related at some level, but it's really second, third order kinds of effects. Here's the, so remember the hinge points were here and here. So whichever one you're looking at, here is the onsets of moralizing gods. And there's some that happened late and there's some that happened early. And that's all that there is to it. The point that I want to make here is that once you identify the hinge points, which have to do with the evolution of knowledge, you can then use those hinge points as a tool to assess other kinds of characteristics of the growth of human societies, the development, I should say, of human societies. More sophisticated statistical analysis will come up with things that are far more sophisticated than those hinge points, and presumably they will themselves then enable yet more subtle analyses of, well, our heritage. Let's see, so am I pretty much out of time? Okay, 3 more minutes. Okay, then I'll quickly illustrate why this is a subtle issue to do a proper statistical analysis of this kind of data. Remember I told you that PCA, principal components analysis, it assumes that your data was generated from a single Gaussian. This is a test that they should have done in their first paper, which they didn't. How legitimate is it to make that assumption? Well, here's PC1 and here's just a scatter plot. And I don't know about you, but that does not look like one Gaussian to me. It looks kind of like 2 Gaussians. And so let me just go through. These are some other statistical artifacts that have to do with what's called the imputation method. But in any case, go through this. Here is a hypothesis that we created and then tested for what might cause the 2 Gaussians. And this is how subtle it is. When you think about how something like the Sechet data set is created, or for that matter, any historical data set, really, there are many interweaving stochastic processes. 2 of the major ones are this. You've got the stochastic process of once I'm actually a society, meaning that I am visible in the archaeological record, the stochastic process of how do my characteristics change in time. It's a stochastic process, so it's noisy. There are no firm rules, thou shalt from this stage to develop that one. All of these patterns, as was clear in those time series arrows I was showing, they're all just general tendencies. That's one statistic process. It's like as I, as a human being, it's the stochastic process of how I actually grow once I've been born. But there's another one, which is when you were born, and more precisely, when you were actually, where in your development stage you first became visible in the archaeological record. Did I first become visible as a 3-year-old, or as a 1-year-old, or as a babbling newborn? If you consider things like, for example, the Latium Plain, Rome, it has been so mined by archaeologists, so to speak, that we are fairly confident that we can go right back to around the time of the, quote, birth of societies who have minimal levels, the minimal thresholds to get into the Sechet data set. But if you look at many other parts of the world, we might not actually have data until the society was actually fairly far along. So you've got a birth process, or more directly, a first birthday party in which there were photographs of you taken, so to speak. And then you've also got just your stochastic development process. So you're a child, you're developing, that's one process. And then over here is the random process of which of your birthdays was the one at which you were first photographed. Our hypothesis was that if you join those two stochastic processes, where the stochastic process of your development is generally going from low to high values of principal one just by a time homogeneous, time unchanging Markov chain, then that can actually lead to the two bumps. And here's some toy data. We actually saw that you do get something that at least to a cartoon level matches those two Gaussian bumps, giving a potential explanation for why they are there in the data set, but also more importantly, illustrating how careful you have to be in your statistical analyses of these kinds of longitudinal data sets. Okay, and I think I'm probably way over time already. So I forgot a conclusion slide. So I'll just end it there. Okay, thank you very much.
Again, as always, a very fascinating talk, David. So thank you very much. And we can have a brief discussion about this talk now. Afterwards, we'll have a panel discussion, which will also involve David. And then, of course, I will ask some questions, but you can also ask further questions. So, Jürgen, you should ask.
I am absolutely fascinated, David. I know your work from, a presentation at Jürgen's Institute. So I have a question or a remark and a proposal. The remark is, of course, there is an underlying assumption, what is a polity, as you called it, or a society. And that is, of course, problematic. But I don't want to play sort of the conceptual fundamentalist or something like that. What I want to address is the specific problem that you see processes, I call them processes of globalization, of societies connecting to each other. And that's, of course, part of the development. There is a finite planet and societies spread over the planet and they connect. And eventually you see them merge or whatnot. So my proposal is simply this. Have you tried clustering the units of analysis in different ways? So let me give you an example. The early Roman Empire may have been limited to Latium or to Italy and so on. And there were the Phoenicians and there were the Greeks. But, lo and behold, it's the same society. I mean, they call themselves Greek, they call themselves Romans. They have kind of different laws, but it must be the same level of technology. It must be the same level of, political sophistication, give and take a bit. So you could easily take the same Seshat data and just say, let's look at larger units and let's see what this kind of scaling does to the analysis. It's just easy to do, I think. And the question is, have you done it?
There we go. There's a huge number of things. That's a very particularly interesting and important one that you just described. There's as I mentioned, the Atlantic Ocean is a very, very crude kind of one, and that we can say New World versus Old World. But why do you have 30 rather than say several hundred, or if you want to coarse grain it as you're describing, maybe only 5 or so, who knows? That could also be changing the analysis. To his credit, Peter, in another paper, did a simple fit of a ARMA model, I believe it was, autoregressive model, where some of the variables were the stage of development of my neighbors, to try to see how much actually there was cross-flow from geographic cross-flow. And in that paper, I mean, it becomes extremely difficult because the data is so thin. So, but in that paper, he came to the conclusion that actually no, he and his collaborators came to the conclusion that actually no, it's not that much matter of migration of cultural technology and so on and so forth from neighbors. It is mostly an intrinsic process. But in this particular data set, the Seshat, there were many, many other major problems. So I fully agree with you, but then let me tell you how we are sort of addressing that. And I have to say that right now, this is only being done by an undergraduate who's working with me for spare time. We just don't have the resource. I don't have the resources right now in terms of people to be working with me on this. But here's so some of the other problems with that data set. One of them is imputations, missing data. This is real data. This is real historical data, real archaeological data. You can go back and it doesn't even matter what the civilization is. Have it be Latium, have it be Egypt, the places that have been really, really, really well mined. As you go further back in time, there's going to be gaps in the data. Moreover, you're going to have lots of, remember there's 51 variables aggregated into 9 complexity characteristics. Well, first of all, maybe it make sense to use different complexity characteristics, but never mind that. What you're going to have is you go back through the data, oops, we don't have a value for that variable. We have all the other ones, but not that one. Go further back, oops, we don't have, you're going to have all these kinds of problems. So I keep using the word stochastic process. I do that with malice or forethought, so to speak. There's a perspective paper that me and Jürgen and Manfred and Mike Price and several others have, we've now got it up on the archive, where we basically make the case that you should explicitly, yes, really view the past as a stochastic process. It's a noisy, trending process. What that gains you is there are some extremely powerful tools that have recently been developed in machine learning, where you can fit, it's basically Bayesian all the way through. So you've actually, it's a Gaussian process model of where you've got points that are steering a Fokker-Planck dynamics, if that's something you're familiar with. And what that allows you to do is completely circumvent the issue of missing data, completely circumvent the issue of even the scaling, coarse graining scales versus fine grained scales. It's very computationally intensive and we don't have the resources to do much with it. But we've been reminding, for example, Seshat, and there's like some data sets having to do with modern day macroeconomics that we've also been doing it, and some other data, now that I think about it, having to do with the growth of cities in the past 2 centuries, where we're applying these same tools that they've developed over there to get to things much more sophisticated in the PCA that hopefully would allow us to also address the kinds of issues that you were raising, where just the scale of analysis could be a crucially determinative feature. Just see how the patterns change as you change the scales, which to anybody with a physics background, by the way, would suggest things like what's called renormalization.
Yeah.
So
I see the impatient look of the chairman. I stop here and I just thank you.
Of course, we'll have the general discussion. So there were 2 more questions, one here and one over there. Maybe if, okay, then you ask the question first and then we have the question there by Ursula.
Me? Well, this may be brought up again in the general discussion, but as you know, a challenge in modern science, which appears on the scientific arena, particularly with the accumulation of big databases in many domains of knowledge, not just this one. And the question is, and the challenge is to synthesize this huge amount of data and to extract new understanding. And my question is, if these methods of complexity analysis could be applied to climate change, biodiversity, and other domains of knowledge, and if you know if they have been applied.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Just so the audience knows, I did not pay him to ask me that question ahead of time. So he came up with it. So as far as applying it, these techniques I was mentioning of fitting a stochastic process to data can be applied to the development of ecosystems, to the development potentially of climate systems. Manfred and I are talking about some of those things, but also I thought at first, so that's definitely, the answer is yes and no, it has not been done. Yes, it seems like it should be able to be done, but no, nobody has tried to do it. Or at least let me be very careful, never ever say no. It has not been done exhaustively or much at a minimum. But also you are making allusions to what are sometimes called the digital humanities, where people do things like text mining and so on of manuscripts from the past, because infamously, no matter how good a scholar you are in the archives, you're only going to be able to get a very narrow slice, whereas these huge data sets can do so much more in sifting for patterns. You can think of ways to combine the digital humanities of texts and some of this archaeological kinds of techniques to address, for example, I had a working group on this, the following question. If I look through the development of civilizations, there are several different cliches for what drives it. One of them is the big leader, the Napoleon, the Alexander the Great, the Julius Caesar, that they were really unusual, that if they did not exist, then history would have developed differently. That's one hypothesis. Another one, a lot of it is that's driven by climate. I guess this is still controversial one way or the other. Oh, Santorini erupts, and then sometime not too long afterwards, Crete, the civilization collapses. So that's a climate event. And there are all kinds of things about volcanoes going off in like Iceland and so on, causing these crop failures in the Middle East and these kinds of things. That's another hypothesis. Another one is kind of an extreme version of Toynbee. You could almost use some of those trends of PC1 is like Toynbee, where it's all, but if we are physicists, chunk of badly done, chronophysics, where we're just all spin glass interacting, and that's all that history amounts to. So, one thing one can do, or at least one should be able to do, is use things like text mining together with these kinds of techniques. There are some ideas for how to combine these, actually assess. Was Napoleon, was he important or not? One way to determine that is to actually learn the trends of the society. Look at how would it have predicted France would have developed after the revolution. Compare that to what really happened. And if it's a very, very big gap, it's very unlikely what really happened. That's strong evidence that Napoleon made a big difference. If instead your model says, well, after that kind of revolution, you would expect the country to take over all of Europe and so on, I'm just going along for the ride.
Thank you, and to be continued.
Yeah, okay, then we have the last question. No, we have just time for one more question. And then we have the panel discussion, and then you can ask further questions.
Yeah, thank you. My question concerns not the analysis of data, but your gathering of data, your selection of data. And in connection with this, your claim to universality. Yeah, how broad, societies are included. It seems to me that you are selecting societies that have already high division of labor and which produce also an economic surplus that can subsidize what you call the high gods. That means a caste of priests, groups of scholars, and so on, who are not themselves directly involved in productive labor. So they are subsidized by the rest of the society, and the society must be rich enough to do this. And we know, of course, that in history there have been agricultural societies, for example, which did not even have craftsmen, really a division of labor, and which have had, of course, one or two priests, but there were no scholars. And we also know that after crisis, take the 30 years war, in which, the society was no longer rich enough, the economy went down. And of course, so the point is, it seems to me that you are selecting data and that this really reduces your claim to universality.
Okay, so first I do have to emphasize, I did not put together this data set. Peter did. And I think that and he put in biases explicitly that they wanted for every natural geographic area. They were concerned correctly with things like the Latium Plain. We have huge more data about that than, for example, the Khmer civilization, where everything is covered by jungle and so on and so forth. So they tried to address that by actually being very selective before even gathering that data, which is a gargantuan problem. And I fully agree. I mean, to give other examples along the lines that you're describing, not far from here, from my perspective at least, the Tripolia area just to the north of the Black Sea, or for that matter, Çatalhöyük, or of course the Harappan civilization, the Indus Valley civilization. It seemed like there weren't any priests, or at least that we can tell, or there wasn't a lot of evidence for social stratification, but nonetheless, they developed huge societies. So you don't need, I agree with your point, but you don't even need to have things like priestly castes for it to be the case that you have very, very big civilizations that leave very, very striking artifacts in the record. So what these trends are, they are universal, modulo these biases in which Peter gathered the data and so on. They are universal among those societies that meet those criteria for going into the data set. There's nothing in here about hunter-gatherer societies. There are things here about pre-agricultural states, but they didn't go through, and there's nothing about, say, the San Bushmen or anything like that. There's nothing about hunter-gatherers. Well, to be sure, yeah, there's nothing here about non-humans. There's nothing here about whales. This is a statement only about those civilizations that fit the criteria for going into the data set. And that's actually, I would give Peter a lot of credit that is actually amazingly universal. I did not believe the results of his paper when I read it.
Okay, then I think for sake of time, we need to conclude that component. There was supposed to be a panel discussion. One of the panelists somehow didn't make it. And so therefore I'm asking all speakers of this afternoon, not only David, but also Rivka and Pietro, to come to the kind of high table here. And I will try to start the discussion by asking some general questions to each speaker. Hopefully that then will inspire and stimulate a general discussion about some of the issues that are relevant and that are also close to the interest and to the heart of Jürgen. So Rivka and Pietro. Please take your seats. And thank you very much again for all the fascinating and inspiring talks. In particular, they presented rich historical material from very different perspectives. And of course, that is a good basis to also ask further questions. And as I said, I want to ask some questions about putting this into a general perspective. So Rivka told us about the Jesuits, and there were certain general issues there. They were interested in science, and they had a couple of good scientists, good mathematicians, but they were not really interested in science for its own sake. They were trying to use science for another purpose, namely to accomplish their mission. And of course, on the way, probably, apparently many of the Jesuits got genuinely interested in the science, but the general purpose of the order was, of course, to spread the Catholic version of Christianity after the Counter-Reformation and the Concile of Trento in the world, and also to spread it to other cultures. And they were discovering that science was an important vehicle to accomplish that. And in order to accomplish that, they had to develop their own scientific skills very profoundly, and they had to be able to argue scientifically at the edge of what was of what could be achieved at that time, and they used all the current developments. They were also interested in other issues, and of course they were conceptualizing things differently from what we are doing today, as we learned from Rivka's talk. So for example, it was about the perception on the human retina, and of course, if you think about it in physical terms, you have an upside down image, and of course that somehow needs to be interpreted and conceptualized. And although there were some issues about the nature of the light coming from the stars, what the stars actually were, what their positions were. So there were also issues of natural philosophy involved in that, epistemology, from epistemology to certain geometric rules and properties, to issues of natural philosophy. Now, if we look at the internet companies today, they also develop science they also want to be at the edge of science. They want to develop science. They have research laboratories, which in many disciplines are at the cutting edge of what is happening. But again, they are not really interested in pursuing science for its own sake. They want to use science in order for rather different purposes. Yeah, and although then there are certain issues there, not only how science is developed, what science is, but also how scientific facts are perceived by the public. So there's also an epistemological issue there, and there might also eventually emerge philosophical issues. So is that a valid and a useful parallel to draw, or would you also consider that as being somewhat abstruse? So would you see a parallel in some sense of what is happening today in those settings, or is that very different in your opinion?
Okay, so my point of departure is to ask the question, what is neutral science? And whether there is neutrality in any kind of discourse. And I must admit that when I try to theorize, and I try to theorize, especially how knowledge spreads, or how knowledge, I call it, I used to call it the migration of knowledge, migrating knowledge, okay? So there's always a political dimension and a dimension of authority. So I try to conceptualize the spread and the migration of knowledge by saying, what are the components of the conception of knowledge itself, and especially scientific knowledge? And of course, there are the objects. And of course, there are the relationship between them and so forth. But there's always the point of view from which the scientist looks at the things. And here it, divides into two, actually. One is the authority. Who has the authority in the process of representation? And whereas we, for many years, we used to think about representation in terms of neutrality. I mean, what is it? It's just one thing represents the other. But I say, no, representation is always also, not only, but also about power. Who has, because at the end, the question is who represents and what kind of power the representation gives to the represented, not only to the represented. When I take, let's say, the example of Louis XIV, but also the representer, has a kind of dimension of power. This is one thing. Representation itself is not about just the act of representing one thing by another, but about authority and power. So my question here is how to analyze the discourse of the new technologies of today, not only the contents, but the discourse. What kind of discourse is being created? And I would say that this leads me to more general questions about knowledge and power. But I try to do it in a very, in a very careful way. Since I look at it from the point of view of human beings in general, I'm trying to think of the universal human being. I don't relate power only to a certain group. It's always there. And the authority of the representative is always there. And we have to take it in consideration when we talk about the object and when we talk about, the context. So is it useful to compare the companies of today to the concept of science adopted by a group of people who definitely had a religious vision and also religious duties, and they did not ignore them. They were both tried to be both educators, teachers, and so forth, and people of religious order, representatives of the Pope, but also having the patronage of the political power. So what I want to say by this is, look, it's not enough to count. Okay, this will come back again and again to the problem. The statistics even are not enough, although they are very important. But you have to have also a conceptual argument, which is qualitative at the end and depends on the scholar. So, I'm trying to find a way between really taking seriously the demand to create knowledge which is neutral, and our limits as human beings that intervene. That's my very long answer to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think there is something that important that we should keep in mind for the later discussion, the relation between knowledge and power. But let me now first turn to Pietro. So you showed us some important aspects of the history of the interaction of people with the lagoon, that is with the maritime environment in Venice. Of course, you can see such examples from other regions in the world. In China, they were continuously building dikes to constrain the Yellow River. The dikes got higher and higher, and the water level got higher and higher until it was several meters above the level of the surrounding landscape. And then, of course, in terms of political instability, the dikes were not maintained and catastrophic flooding happened. Then the dynasty collapsed, a new dynasty came into power, they built again the dikes, and the story continued. So it is a less successful and more dramatic story as the one that you showed in Venice, because after all in Venice, for a long time, it was relatively successful. People apparently acted in a responsible manner. They were careful about not overfishing and all that, and keeps the environment of the lagoon. Now, of course, we also see modern attempts to preserve Venice and the lagoon in view of the rising sea levels, with perhaps with the best modern technology that we can currently conceive of. So to what extent do you see a continuity here? Or would you rather see a break here in the traditional way people in Venice interacted with the maritime environment and tried to preserve it, and the modern way that now not only people in Venice, but from all over Italy and perhaps from many parts of the world are trying to preserve Venice from being flooded?
So thank you. So I would say I have a comparative interest, as you noticed from my images, and I think so I have a comparative interest that's part of my engagement, but I'm more interested in looking at the way to address the world as its history. And this history is not just an objective series of processes that you can just describe from the outside, but we are part of this process. So the big problem, the challenge, that's why I call it geopraxis, is to look at a process to which we belong. And we belong not just as objective factors to be considered, but as actors of the development itself. So I'm looking at Venice not as a spot or something that you can isolate in a laboratory, but it's rather the reconstruction of the connections between the past, the present, and the future. And the point about this future is that it's not just the outcome of the process. That's what I tried to show. So we don't just take out one element of the historical process and we see how it could have developed elsewhere. Otherwise, we are part, so the historical logic is the logic of path dependencies. So this logic of path dependencies means once you take certain decisions, you trace the route of what will come next. So we can speculate of what would have been in case, but that's not the case. And that's the problem of the universal, the concrete universal that we are dealing with once we speak about the planet as a whole, history as a whole. And I know big narratives are always scary, but we should also try to think, Rivka speaking about this tension between being part of an engagement and thinking in universal terms, not in order to, and I would say, in order not to essentialize who we are as humans, as cultures. Otherwise, we have this competing, isolated, artificially created spots that are, I think, flowed from a scientific viewpoint, so of understanding, and they're also flowed from the practice that they generate, because they generate division in the end. So they have a function, and this function is a destructive function. So I think this is the big problem about what you call the biases. Let's make the biases explicit. I wouldn't call them biases, but let's call them like that. So the perspective, let's make our standpoints explicit. So at some point we need to discuss about the positionings out of which we construct our knowledge, and we create through our knowledge the world we live in. Of course, it's a bit simplified, but I point to this because this is the philosophical, epistemological, political questions that we need to address. So I would rephrase the question about the neutrality of science and its applications to the general question of the function of science. So even the non-neutrality of science, what's the function of that non-neutrality? So we bring it back to the earth, say from the viewpoint of its genesis, validity, and goals.
So there were two important aspects that we keep in mind. On one hand, the epistemological aspect and the non-neutrality of science, but also the past dependency of historical developments. But now let me finally turn to David before we open the general discussion. Again, the topic somehow is science and society, and society probably means modern society. And the data set looked at ancient societies, but of course it raises general questions. There was already the question of the mutual dependency between different societies, societies succeeding each other, the Ottomans taking over the Byzantine Empire. More generally, there are also questions about the relation between correlations and causations in the different aspects of the data set behind that. So one would like to know which are the real drivers and which are just indicators of development. So for example, if you look at astronomical knowledge could be a driver of agricultural practices because you can predict the seasons more precisely, when to harvest and when to plant the seeds and so on, and when the flood of the Nile is coming. Perhaps you can also improve the weather forecasts on the basis of scientific knowledge. But on the other hand, maybe some astronomical knowledge was just a byproduct of agricultural observations. And you also had this interesting question of the moralizing gods. And so it's not only the question, when did they occur or did they necessarily occur? It is also the question of what their role actually is. So now when we are currently dealing with climate change, there's also a strong moral undertone to much of the debate. So we are now reminded that we should act according to moral principles, that we should try to preserve the planet, that we should preserve biodiversity and whatever that is. So there might be some analogies with the role of the moralizing gods in earlier societies in order to stabilize certain patterns, but also in order, but more importantly, to prevent catastrophic developments to happen. So the question is then, from the profound novel analysis of historical data and in particular the generation and accumulation of historical data, can we get more general insights about the development of societies, about correlations and causations, and also the functions of certain processes in the society that might also apply to modern societies?
Let's see. How many hours do we have to respond? A lot of questions there. First off, yeah, this is all correlational. There's no what are called instrumental variables. There's nothing in here about any kind of Granger causality, never mind interventional causality a la Judah Pearl or anything like that. So therefore, like any observational data set, you do not dare use the results as a sole basis for how to intervene. Because basically you've got no information about what that kind of distortion to the underlying dynamics could cause. You can imagine extending it in many ways that would allow you to say something about intervention, but it does not right now provide you that capability. Another problem with using this kind of data set concerning anything having to do with the Anthropocene is that Seshat, as you mentioned, it only goes up to about 1800 really. And quite honestly, it goes much earlier than that. So you have to look at much more recent data sets. And so there's several people that I'm looking at certain things with. Manfred's involved in looking at some more recent data sets, specifically with regards to the Anthropocene. And of course, there are people like Jeff West who like to talk about singularities and successions of singularities, where he's extending certain scale-dependent data sets into the future. But this data set and these systems have not been sent that way, have not been used in that way, have not been modified for that purpose as of yet. The other questions you were asking about moralizing, the data is consistent with the hypothesis that moralizing high gods are irrelevant. And I would argue that in many senses, what history teaches us, big history, works like, for example, the great data sets that Ian Morris put together, and Peregrine's Atlas of Human Evolution and so on. The Malthusian trap has been continual until the rise of science. So life's been brutish and short and Hobbesian for almost all of history, with one exception. And it's frankly a big mystery. One might want to say that this is perhaps the greatest practical benefit of science, as one hypothesis, is that starting around 1500 or so in the West, according to all kinds of text mining analyses and many other measures, life got more peaceful and better, starting in the West and eventually spreading to the rest of the world. If you just look at things like the records in the Old Bailey, in the English court, Simon Tadeo's got some good studies of this, of the kinds of things that would cause a prisoner to be put to death. They change from being crimes of property to being crimes of body as society developed. If you just look through the literature at how extended our inclusive notion is, women had no rights anywhere, full stop. Never mind minorities or anything like that. Never mind things like people who are LGBTQ. All of these things have developed in a succession more recently. Violence rates have been dropping through the floor, all the standard things like if you are a male in a hunter-gatherer society, it's something like you got a 15% chance that you will die at the hands of another male. And yeah, there's murder rates in modern societies that are far, far too high, but they're nowhere close to being 15%. So a lot concerning moralizing seems to have started for a very mysterious reason. Nobody really can say. I mean, coincidentally, science got going in the West around then. Is that coincidence, correlation, irrelevant? Who knows? But it didn't start anywhere else. And it certainly got nothing to do with any kind of superiority of human Christianity or anything. Well, Weber might argue with that, but I would say it doesn't. So that's a great mystery. All of that being said, does this give me any reason to believe that it's going to save the planet? No, I don't. This is purely personal now, but the climate change train, from my perspective, has already left the station. That what people are going to be discussing within a decade or so, if not earlier, they're already discussing a little bit, is geoengineering. Things like solar geoengineering, because people are still too much tragedy of the commons. Actions speak louder than words. There have been all kinds of words from all these protocols, and they've not come to anything. And I see no reason to believe that that's going to change in time to actually turn over the curves. So even though we are a more moral society now than other societies have ever been, it's not nearly good enough for us to not cause a lot of damage to our nest.
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, most of us have to share your rather pessimistic view, but be that as it may, let me now open the floor for the general discussion. Maybe Jürgen wants to make some systematic comments and raise some questions, and then other participants will also be welcome until we reach a certain time threshold when we should definitely stop. And perhaps the organizers can give me some signal when I should really stop.
Well, first of all, I didn't only like the talks, I also like this panel a lot. It's a format that we might have considered also for this morning. So I would, include in the general discussion also the speakers of this morning, which I might have to add to this picture. I have no systematic remarks, but I may have single remarks. The picture that you drew of the Jesuits, I think, Rivka was very polite, but I think we both really don't agree with them, because the Jesuits were very interested in science. And the role model of a Jesuit, we know by Chun, who is still with us, Tien Miao, I don't know whether she's with us, Matthias is here. We know that, becoming a Jesuit was a ticket to travel to the world. It was the only ticket available to scientists. So some scientists became Jesuits in order not to become missionaries, but to become, travelers, scientific travelers. So I think, there are very strong individual variations. I also like very much Rivka's point, there is an epistemological framework which mixes power and knowledge in every scientific statement. And it's part of the mission of the history of science to bring these epistemological preconditions to the fore, and that's what I understood she was doing. So these are unsystematic remarks, but just to throw another light. And as far as the last remarks by David is concerned, yeah, I share the pessimism, and it brings up another question, because we historians look at cases like Venice, as Pietro has done. But also other non-European examples. Tenochtitlan comes to mind as a city. Some of these cities may have been much more sustainable than our modern cities, as a matter of fact. There's always the hope that we can learn from these, particularly also from the non-European cases of more sustainable environments. But you might be right, that there might even be an end to the possibility to learn from history as far as more sustainable ways of economy and living is concerned. And in the end, we might just have to resort to very brutal measures. But as long as we are not sure, historical examples may help us to learn, for instance, about patterns of urban growth. we haven't talked about the great acceleration. You mentioned briefly Geoffrey West and Betancourt, and Manfred is also working on this. So the question is, of course, what actually causes this growth? What is behind the growth phenomenon? Is that already a phenomenon deeply ingrained in cultural evolution, or maybe in urban evolution? Is this kicking in at some later moment with the Industrial Revolution? So, with Manfred and Ricarda is also here, we have been discussing a lot, what the positive feedback loops are and what might be negative feedback loops. So that is at least, a point of possible systemic intervention to better understand what is the dynamism behind this, exponential growth that we are seeing here.
Yeah, one point I think I could add to that, it hasn't been mentioned at all in this forum, but another view I have is that this is the last century in which the only data store of intelligent creatures will be the current human genome. CRISPR means that there are going to be non-human sentience, probably within several decades. And especially as it's not so much a single artificial general intelligence, but as very powerful computers start to interact with one another, it's almost inconceivable that by the year 2100, we'll be the only owners of this planet who are sentient. So there are going to be some major, major disruptions one way or another, in addition to everything that's going on with climate change. Who knows how all this is going to come together?
Yeah, but there is a parallelism, if I may react to that. The parallelism is, of course, that we are shaping this world, consciously or not, doesn't matter.
Exactly.
But whether it's climate change or whether it's the creation of new forms of machine intelligence or genetic engineering, we are doing it. And so our responsibility is huge. And, as scientists, I would always argue that we have to format our knowledge and our knowledge generation processes in a way as to be, living up to this kind of responsibility. I mean, that's the ideal that we are striving for.
Yep.
Yeah, let me then ask whether there are further questions from the audience.
Or from the other speakers from this morning who were.
Yeah, right. I don't, there apparently was one.
Yes, thank you for all the interesting talks today. I must say I was also intrigued by the MHG or the MH or the MG. So I looked it up on the internet and it has 2,230 hits. So I wonder what this was. I mean, the moralizing high God. And of course, this work and your talk, on which I was very impressed, I must say, it creates quite a new parameter for historical studies. And in fact, but there's a huge work to find the drivers who are part of these statistics. And what do we mean by this moralizing high God? I mean, you could have a high God or semi-high God, like Akhenaton's sun god, or like Ishtar in Sargon's empire. And they are become high gods in a sense. But they are not at all moralizing. They like war, they like power. So I think the work of making categories for those drivers to correlate with this wonderful statistics, I think is a great challenge. And that I think is crucial to use it. And also, for example, one could think of a lot of drivers, but they should be kind of excerpted from historical material as we have it. And I saw on the Sheshet data, they have also this axial age data. Of course, that's important that, I mean, human thinking seems to kind of discover or discuss what is the individual in various ways, in a social and a kind of theological or religious way. So to find the drivers for this statistics, I wish everybody good luck to find them. Thank you.
David, you want to answer quickly, and then I give the floor for final words to Pietro and Rivka, and then we have to conclude the sessions for reasons of time.
I'm afraid, can maybe you summarize? Was there a question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, perhaps it was a statement, but if you want to have a final word, no, you can say it now.
I speak too much anyway.
Okay, then
So-
we move on to Pietro
Okay.
and then to Rivka.
Yeah, I would connect immediately to this issue because it's been in the air. So the moralizing gods, we get back to the question about the function of ideas in history. So the function of religion in history. To put it bluntly, it's like the problem of ideology. Okay, that's how I would
Yes.
phrase it. And then we can start thinking, okay, is it an apt concept? How does it work? So we have conceptual tools to deal with this, or other ones, hegemony, cultural. I mean, so there is a set of discussions about how to deal with religion and what is the function of religion in history and the history of religion as a discipline. So I think this is something to take into account, which would lead us also away from some simplistic assumptions, if I can call them like this. So I might agree that modernity, if I understood from 16th century onward, was a more moral time. I might agree on that, but not more peaceful. So that's something we should.
The data sets are very clear.
No,
The
but
data sets are very
data
clear.
sets are clear, but let me point to some historical facts, and then we can take the data sets, and I will say something about how the problem of data set. So 16th century is in many ways a time of big changes at the world scale. It's the time of colonialism. So modernity is a colonial enterprise. So we need an assessment of colonialism. If we say that the data show us that it's a peaceful time,
Within
then we
Europe
should ask
only.
ourselves the question, so what do we do with the European colonialism?
Yep,
What do
it's-
we do with Inquisition? What do we do with wars of religion? What do we do with witchcraft? And there is a whole set of historiographical work that dealt explicitly with this. Plenty of literature. The libraries are full of literature on this. And then if your data set shows something different, it's a peaceful time, then we should argue that the whole issue about colonialism, Inquisition, wars of religion, so is a superficial phenomenon that doesn't need to be taken into account because the pattern is different. That leads me to a big question about what we can extract from the data. I had a discussion recently with geologists who were dealing with geological modeling. So the way we take data, what data, how we model them, and we get to meaningful results. At some point, we came to an epistemological problem, and that's the problem of intuition. So at some point, they brought up to the floor the problem of intuition. We need they said, there is a moment in which there is some intuition that is needed in order to find the meaningful correlation, perhaps the meaningful causality, but that's another, I don't go into the causality. And then I had a discussion, and I think it's still a discussion to be carried on how much education, preparation, scientific training we need in order to have intuitions. So applied to geology, it would mean how much geology do we need to study in order to see some correlations that are meaningful from data, in the choice of the data, in the meaningful correlation. And I put this question here, speaking about history. How much history do we need in order to make meaningful correlations about historical data? 0, so data just speak by themselves, or how much experience we need in going underway with history in order to see the connections?
That's why there were 50 archaeologists, 51 archaeologists on that paper with expertise in all their different fields, precisely so they would have those intuitions. Concerning my statement about a peaceful time, that did not include anything about colonialism. I didn't want to be very, very specific, but it was Eurocentric, primarily white male landowners. All those caveats are most definitely there. But among that cohort, the notion of a morality was very clearly changing. The text mining, far, far more exhaustive than any single historian can possibly come up with. It's very clear. Terms of violence go down, terms of inclusiveness go up, legal codes change in such a way, and so on. So I'm not just saying some kind of abstract data about wealth or something. I'm being very, very particular. And yes, one can even imagine a model in which the violence that would have gone on in Europe, the Europeans exported it to instead be violence to the rest of the world. You can even imagine that model. I'm not saying imputing any kind of morality to it. I'm simply noting it was sui generis. It's the only time that's actually happened in history. And that, to me, as a scientist, is very, very interesting. Why was that different? If we knew why it was different, we could perhaps maybe exaggerate that process going forward. If we could look through history and find those instances in which what we would now very loosely call the moral perspective actually grew and was more inclusive, if we knew what caused that, maybe we would be able to cause it now and maybe salvage more of the biodiversity.
Yeah, that is very important discussion. I think David, on the basis of the facts that he's stating, is correct. But of course, Pietro's point is that the aggression just got exported to other regions of the world, and it also got lifted to a higher scale. So the wars from the 30 Years' War to the First and Second World War were much more devastating than wars had been in previous periods. But that was just violence at a much larger scale. So individually, of course, between individual members of society, I guess you're perfectly right that the level of violence decreased, at least in European countries. But
No. I actually disagree very strongly. Yuan civilization, when it took over, for example, the collapse of the Northern Song dynasty, estimates are that due to famine, a quarter of the population of China was wiped out in one fell swoop. And this was achieved by people who only had as technology bows and arrows. It's amazing how widespread the massive scales of violence were. So it's not just only individual against individual, it's society-wide. I mean, for that matter, who were, well, to really push the envelope here, who were the original super evil people in society? It was the Assyrians. If you read what the Assyrian civilizations did when they conquered, frankly, and especially given the very, very primitive technology, they did their best to be evil. And if you could just imagine if they had had the technology that, for example, the Europeans had, what would have happened? So actually, even on large scales, the 20th century large-scale violence, it's an outlier in that it seems that large-scale warfare in the 20th century does not seem to have continued down a trend in terms of things like percentage of population killed. But aside from that, there have been massive, massive evils done by human against human through all of history.
Okay, let's not get too much into this very dark side of human nature and leave perhaps more optimistic or positive outlook, and give the final word to Rivka now. So please.
No, the truth is that I'm doing something rather different than what is being done here, and I'm extremely excited and curious to know more about this collection of data and then their analysis, because my first concern is how do we catalog, in fact, and then conceptualize the various kinds of discourses that we meet in history, including our own. And for me, the question is, what are the relevant, as I said before, what are the relevant categories for such an analysis? And I will repeat them: the object, the boundaries between different kinds of discourses. So history is different than history of science in various ways. It doesn't mean that they don't overlap, but it means that we need to know the structure of the discourse in order to assess what is being told. And so the objects, the boundaries between them, the authority of the speakers and the interaction. And finally, I find the category of place, the place of knowledge, very, very relevant for doing this kind of analysis. So it's different, but I think it's a different dimension also of what is history, what is historical discourse, how do we analyze it, and so forth.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rivka, for this final word and bringing us really back to the history of science. So when I held the microphone in my hands, I couldn't really applaud the speakers, but I want to do it now for your great talks and also for the panel discussion. And now I think the organizers should tell us what is going to happen in the evening, because perhaps not everybody is fully informed.
Okay, so it's very easy, I think. So you have to. So we will have this concert at 7 at the Miramare Castle. In order to go to the Miramare Castle, it's a good question. So it's you have the map, and exercise 1, find the Miramare Castle. Okay, no, jokes apart. But it would be better if you are already towards the entrance of the castle around 6:45, right?
No, even later.
Okay, 7. And you have to use the main gate of the Miramare Castle.
Which is the one along the seaside.
Which is the one along the seaside, and which is the closest to here. I tried to give you a quick flash on how to go there. So once you reach the main road where the bus, the main road down the hill here, you know, the main road going along the sea, you go left and there is an underground passage which takes you directly to the beach. And now I tell you, tomorrow nobody will be here. So you go underground and you reach the seaside. Once you reach the seaside,